I call Portable Williams.
Kia ora, Mr Chairman. As the first Cook Islander to take a call on this, I just want to make a little comment that this bill is intended to support those people who want to return to the Cook Islands, Niue and Tokelau to return. Even the esteemed member who just spoke before me, he too can take advantage of this bill, return to the Cook Islands and collect his pension. And he too can be basking in the sun at the Swordfish Club. Because this bill, Mr Chairman, is about supporting people not only to return home for their retirement, but if this government had taken note of the submitters, it could be for younger people to return home and contribute to the economy of the Cook Islands. The purpose of this bill, Mr Chairman, is to allow people who are eligible for the New Zealand super to collect that super in the countries of the realm, namely the Cook Islands, Niue and Tokelau. And that doesn't just mean people who have a close affinity or have a blood connection to those islands of the realm, Mr Chair. That actually means each and every one of us as New Zealanders have that opportunity to do that. So that is, the previous speaker is quite right in his assertions. This is an important bill for all people, and in fact, when we were first debating this, the first reading, I know I made the comment that this would be something that I would consider to do myself. Given the opportunity, it's something that I would really like to do. My colleague Carmel Sepuloni talked about what happened when we were given, as countries of the realm, free association with New Zealand. Because what it means, Mr Chair, is that we have New Zealand citizenships, as New Zealand citizenship as people who are of Cook Island, Niue and Tokelau descent. We travel on New Zealand passports, we are New Zealand citizens. And what that meant, particularly when the first planes started to go to the Cooks in the 1960s, it meant that we could travel quite freely as Cook Islanders. And we did. We travelled freely, and it meant that our home islands became quite depopularised, if that's a phrase. So now we're in a situation, thank you, now we have the situation back in the home islands where we've got low numbers of people to support the economy and to support as taxpayers. And this bill, when it was first promoted, was asking for people to return home to the Cooks, to Niue and Tokelau, not necessarily as older people in their retirement, but as people who had done, had built up some expertise and experience in this country, and possibly some backing in terms of their financial status, to take that back home to the Cooks, to Niue, to Tokelau, to set up businesses, take their expertise back there and create the economies, develop the economies back in the realm islands. I mean, I remember my own father used to take advantage of going back to the Cooks in the winter time to escape the winter here. Sometimes he would go without my mother, much to my mother's distress, but he would do so at 3 or 4 months at a time, and would come back to New Zealand because there was the requirement to be that you couldn't be out of the country for more than 6 months. You needed to continue to reapply for your New Zealand super. What this bill does, Mr Chairman, is that it changes that eligibility requirement. Initially, you need to work in New Zealand for 10 years. That's the first part of the qualification, to gain 50% of New Zealand super. Then, Mr Chair, in order to have 100% of super, you should work for 20 years. But then there is another requirement. Post the age of 50, you should be resident and present in New Zealand for 5 years. Now, what that means, Mr Chairman, is that you may have already returned to the Cooks, you may have set up a business, and there are lots of young entrepreneurial and not so young entrepreneurial people in the Cooks particularly who are working in the tourist industry. You know, people who operate businesses like the Swordfish Club or diving operations or hotels and motels. Mr Chairman, if they want to collect their New Zealand super, which they are entitled to do as New Zealand citizens and having met the earlier eligibility requirement, Mr Chair, they then have to return back to New Zealand, Mr Chairman, they have to return back to New Zealand for 5 years. That makes no sense whatsoever. They have to leave their businesses, they have to leave their jobs and their families and return to New Zealand for a period of 5 years. Now, some of the submitters told us, Mr Chairman, that they were leaving jobs behind and coming back to New Zealand and going on the dole. That makes no sense at all. The submitters were very, very clear about this particular point. It would make a huge difference to them if that criteria wasn't required, if they didn't have to do that 5 years post age 50. It would make a huge amount of difference. It was such a significant clause in the bill that we had an extraordinary thing happen. We had 2 heads of state come and present to the Select Committee, both the Prime Minister of the Cook Islands and the Premier of Niue, as well as our ministers of their cabinet, came and presented to the Select Committee to say, if there is one thing we would change about this bill, it would be to remove that requirement of being resident and present in New Zealand for 5 years after the age of 50. It would make a significant difference, which is what New Zealand First has put up as a SOP, and it would make a huge difference, Mr Chairman. It would make a huge difference. It was such a significant clause that members of the Select Committee asked the officials to go away and ask, how much would that cost? What would the cost be to New Zealand if we were to take that eligibility requirement out? And the answer to that, Mr Chairman, is between 9 million and 21 million. In terms of a flag referendum, Mr Chairman, that is peanuts, and it is significant because a small amount between 9 and 21 million would make a huge difference to those 3 realm islands. Huge difference. The cost benefit to New Zealand is that people would move to the Cooks, to Niue and to Tokelau earlier. They would no longer be a burden on the health system. In terms of New Zealand aid into those realm islands, they would be developing businesses and supporting the economy back in those realm islands, and they would no longer be a burden on the New Zealand taxpayer. So for a small amount of money, it would have made a significant difference to those realm islands. The other thing I want to say about this, Mr Chairman, and I've got a lot to say on this topic, is that what this bill points to as well, the unintended consequence of this bill is about the quality of citizenship. Because the people from the Cooks, Niue and Tokelau are New Zealand citizens. But by having this eligibility requirement, it means that these citizens are treated differently to other New Zealand citizens. I was at the Christchurch citizenship ceremony last night, and we play a video from the Governor-General who says, when you become a citizen of New Zealand, you are entitled to all the rights and responsibilities of New Zealand citizens. That includes eligibility around your New Zealand super. When you are resident in the Cook Islands, Mr Chairman, do you know that if you are resident in the Cook Islands for 5 years, that counts towards your citizenship application to New Zealand? So this bill actually says that the Cook Islands, Niue and Tokelau, being resident in there means nothing in terms of your New Zealand citizenship. So if there's one question I would like to ask the Minister, it is why we have this eligibility requirement. I would like the Minister to ask why she believes that this eligibility requirement is required, because it clearly makes a huge difference to the people of the realm islands, and it does set up a different class of citizenship. It is evident that if that wasn't the case, the benefit to New Zealand would be greater, and in fact it would make it much fairer. It would actually align the other citizenship requirements for this country. Mr. Speaker, I want to be really clear about what the submitters said. There were, I think, somewhere in the region of 13 or 14 submitters. Every single one, bar one of the submitters who spoke about the war pensions, every single one.
I call the Honourable Anne Tolley.
Mr. Chairman, I'm very happy to rise to my feet